Welcome to Mano, U.S. Puerto Rico, Journey Toward a More Perfect Union.
A podcast amplifying the voices of leaders, thinkers, activists, and allies from across the political spectrum who support Puerto Rico's fight for full democracy and self-determination.
I'm George Laws Garcia, Executive Director of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council.
And I'm Martin Rivera, Director of Advocacy. In today's episode, we want to share a significant update in the efforts to advance legislation to solve Puerto Rico's political status in the U.S. Senate. We also want to discuss key issues shaping the 2024 general election and how they connect to efforts to decolonize Puerto Rico.
Later in the show, we'll host an in-depth conversation about how the current legislative efforts in Congress on Puerto Rico status build on a long history of past proposals and why today we're on the brink of a major breakthrough. For that discussion, I'll be joined by Professor Charles Venator-Santiago from the University of Connecticut. And with him, we will dive into the history, demographics, and politics that have increased the demand for change on the island and shaped the options offered in the Puerto Rico Status Act.
So, let's get started.
All right, Martin. Well, let's kick it off with some news and updates. What is this big development in Congress that you're talking about, and how is it all connected to the 2024 general election?
Well, first and foremost, just to update everyone as to what's going on in Congress, the House is currently in session this week, but the Senate's out for the next 2 weeks for recess. The big announcement was that the Senate Subcommittee on Public Lands, Forests, and Mining of the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources scheduled a hearing on the Puerto Rico Status Act.
That's big.
It's huge because obviously it shows the fruits of the labor of all the grassroots to finally have a hearing before Congress. The other part of the development is not so great is that the hearing was postponed, unfortunately.
That is so frustrating. The Senate says we're going to hold a hearing, and then they postpone it.
Yeah, but again, it does occur. Unfortunately, we heard that there was a conflict in the schedule of the chairwoman and several other members, and we shouldn't be too surprised by this. Last week, not only was there an executive order on DACA and immigration by the president that occurred at the same time as the hearing was scheduled, but there was also the Juneteenth holiday, which a lot of members actually left town early and missed votes on the floor for the rest of the week because of that holiday. It's unfortunate that the hearing got postponed, but it shouldn't mean that the hearing won't occur. We've already heard that the hearing, if it does occur in July, it will be around mid-July at the earliest. At the latest, September, hopefully sooner than later, but it doesn't mean that the hearing will not occur.
Just the fact that this hearing was announced, that it's going to happen in the United States Senate, is huge. We've been talking about it as something that was a possibility, and now it's actually been brought together and posted. So whether it happened last week or now in July or possibly in September, there is going to be an opportunity for this issue to be discussed for the first time in 11 years in the United States Senate. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we have to see as progress, because every step forward advances our issue. Now, Martin, can you tell us a little bit about what the hearing notice actually said that was going to be talked about in the hearing?
Yeah, so it's a legislative hearing. It's not an general hearing. Usually general hearings are about the issue itself. This is actually a legislative hearing on two different proposals, S3231 by Senator Mano Heinrich, which is the Puerto Rico Status Act, and then an alternate proposal, which is deceptively named the same, even though it had no input from the authors of the Puerto Rico Status Act in the House. It had no input from people on the island. But again, it's named the same.
So we have the Puerto Rico Status Act that was introduced by Senator Mano Heinrich last November, which is a really big deal because it already has the support of, 26?
26 co-sponsors.
26 co-sponsors. It builds off of the bill that was approved in the House in 2022. And then we have another bill, the Wicker bill.
Yes, Senator Wicker, when I say he had no input from anybody on the island, unlike the Puerto Rico Status Act by Senator Heinrich that followed all the work that happened in the previous Congress and the House that had two legislative hearings on the predecessors to the Puerto Rico Status Act. It had a year-long negotiations between members in the House, and which provided also public input from the general public prior to introduction of the Puerto Rico Status Act, and even a public forum on the island so that the people of Puerto Rico could actually provide their input. And all that occurred prior to the even introduction of the Status Act in the House last Congress. Then afterwards, it passed the House with unanimous Democratic support and 16 Republicans. And now we have it this Congress, again, reintroduced in the House, and Senator Heinrich has it in the Senate. But prior to introduction in the Senate, knowing that there was momentum on this bill, Senator Wickard and without any input of any of the lead sponsors, decided to introduce his own version of the bill that has unconstitutional provisions, including the preemption of federal law, while creating an unconstitutional enhanced commonwealth, which, again, there is no such thing as an enhanced commonwealth. There's only two options for Puerto Rico, and that are outside the territorial clause, and that's statehood or independence with or without free association. If you remain a territory, you are a territory. And the thing that they keep proposing as an enhanced commonwealth where Puerto Rico pays no federal taxes, gets all the rights and privileges, but they get to choose which federal laws applies to them is nothing but a pipe dream.
So let me just break it down and simplify this for our audience. We have the actual decolonization bill for Puerto Rico that offers voters real non-territorial alternatives to solve the issue. And then we've got the Wicker bill that steals the name, confuses everything, and adds in a fantasy option that would just make everything a big sham.
Right.
Okay. All right. Well, there we go on that.
Pretty much got it.
I think it's really important then that we talk a little bit about who were the witnesses that were announced to be on this. So who did the committee notice?
So they announced Governor Pedro Pierluisi representing the statehood option, Pablo Jose Hernandez Rivera representing the Commonwealth or current territory status, Juan Manuel Dalmau representing the independence option, and they got Dr. Rafael Cox Salomar to represent the free association option presented. And the minority brought Mr. Jeff Arkin of the Government Accountability Office, which is mainly just basic data. So I'm guessing that's why they probably brought him in.
On economic issues and
right.
Other things. All right. So that's really interesting. So we'll see when that hearing gets rescheduled. We are going to continue advocating, and we would highly encourage that all of our supporters continue sending messages to Congress to tell them that holding this hearing is absolutely essential. And you can do that by going to pr51st.com and going to our Take Action. So part of the reason why the hearing was postponed is actually because there was this big announcement held in the White House, and they asked all of these senators to come in at literally the exact same time that the hearing was supposed to be scheduled. Tell us, what was this big announcement that the White House was doing, and how is it connected to this issue of Puerto Rico's status?
So this is the second executive order President Biden has signed in regards to immigration. Earlier this month in June, he signed another executive order barring some migrants who crossed the southern border unlawfully from receiving asylum. That was more of the stick approach. This was more of the fig leaf or the olive branch approach, because last Tuesday afternoon, the Biden administration signed an executive order that allows certain undocumented immigrants, spouses of U.S. citizens, to apply for lawful permanent residency without leaving the country. This would apply to around 500,000 American families and roughly 50,000 non-citizen children immigrants. And to be eligible for this, you would need to be a person who have lived here in the United States for at least 10 years and be legally married to a U.S. citizen. Also, it allows DACA recipients and Dreamers who have earned a degree to receive work visas.
That makes sense. And all of this is really happening in the context of what's happening in the 2024 general election. Obviously, both Republicans and Democrats are trying to get as many voters to support them as possible. The issues around the border and immigration are hot topic issues when it comes to the 2024 general election. And President Biden was trying to do his best to show Hispanic voters that he cares about their issues and wants to address them. Where does this leave the issue of Puerto Rico's political status? How does that come into the equation?
I'll give you one example. I came from Puerto Rico when I was 8 years old, and just the integration and having to learn English. And even though like us Puerto Ricans were U.S. citizens, we share a similar story with a lot of people who are undocumented, who come to this country, or migrants who come to this country who have to not just learn the ways of the United States, and you might have to learn the language, you might have to assimilate in some way. Sometimes we're disregarded. We're seen as other than.
Yeah.
And that's a shared experience that a lot of the migrant community and several Puerto Ricans have. We've seen it, unfortunately, several times where Puerto Ricans go either rent a car or try to do something else, and they are
treated as if they're foreigners.
And they get that experience first time, just mainly because they're Latino. Those similar experiences show how we're all trying to achieve a
sense of participation, belonging,
quality of representation, of acknowledgement of the contributions that we put to this nation. So I feel like that's something that the Puerto Rican community and the community that's trying to resolve Puerto Rico's political status can join with other Latino groups and issues to actually advance progress towards actually resolving these inequalities throughout our nation.
I like that. I like that. I think that that makes a lot of sense. And, having grown up on the island and moved stateside, I think a lot of people take for granted their United States citizenship. And that's really kind of at the core of this debate of resolving Puerto Rico's territory status, because the only status option that guarantees United States citizenship is statehood. And ultimately, even if there's some transitionary measures for free association or independence, the goal of either of those options really has to be to eventually phase out U.S. citizenship. And, if that ends up happening, then a lot of the people in Puerto Rico will be facing similar challenges to what are being faced by the immigrant community in the United States right now that the president was trying to address with his executive order.
Yeah, and that's why these issues are so integral to the upcoming 2024 general election, which this upcoming Thursday, the first debate will be occurring between President Biden and former President Trump. Should be interesting to see what issues are discussed, especially since both camps are trying to get the Latino vote, which is integral going into the 2024 general election. So I'm going to keep an eye out on to see what issues get brought up, immigration, but also not all Latinos are just interested in immigration issues. A good example would be Puerto Ricans.
Yeah.
Again, we'll see if our issue gets brought up in any way. And also the importance of knowing how these candidates are approaching our community, given the significant power that our community has electorally now stateside, since 5.8, close to 6 million Puerto Ricans live stateside, and how we are going to shape this upcoming election.
Puerto Ricans are the second largest Hispanic group in the entire United States after Mexican Americans, and that matters. Mm-hmm. Yet, oftentimes when we talk about Hispanic issues in the context of the national, politics, immigration is the only issue that's brought to the table. And Puerto Ricans really feel left out of that conversation to a great extent. But it's fascinating that the issue of Puerto Rico's political status is still kind of connected to that common thread of Hispanic experience, where we're part of this country, we contribute to this country, we work here, we pay taxes, and yet we're still seen as an other and separate. So, I think that's really an interesting perspective to offer.
Speaking of 2024 general election, in Puerto Rico, they just had their primaries for resident commissioner and for the governor's position. Real quick, resident commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez Colon beat incumbent governor Pedro Pierluisi 54% to 45%, close to 10% margin, which is quite
huge.
Significant.
Yeah.
Obviously, they always recertify the results and wait to see, but those are the results from election night, as well as for the resident commissioner's position. State Senator William Villafañe beat Elmer Roman Gonzalez 54 to 45, which is ironic from those results is that Senator Villafañe was actually with Governor Pierluisi in his ticket, and Elmer Roman was in the other ticket. But I've seen since then they've all mended fences, and they're all...
Well, it just also shows that voters are going after who they want and not necessarily who's coming out together. And I think it gives me faith that voters are choosing based on their own criteria as opposed to what they're being told to vote. Mm-hmm. And what happened with the Popular Democratic Party, which is the pro-Commonwealth Party?
The ones running for the governor's race, State Rep Jesus Manuel Ortiz Gonzalez beat State Senator Juan Zaragoza Gomez, 61 to 38. That was even a bigger margin. And for the resident commissioner's position, it's already Pablo Jose Hernandez who's going to be running for that position.
So one of the things that I thought was interesting about that is that the two main political parties in Puerto Rico, the pro-Commonwealth Party and the pro-statehood party, more voters came out for the pro-statehood party than for the Popular Democratic Party, which kind of shows where the general electoral trend has been moving in Puerto Rico.
It foreshadows who's going to come out in the general election. Yep. So that doesn't look that good for the Popular Party, in my opinion. But hey, we'll see what happens in the general election. But again, it's very interesting to see the results. And like I mentioned, it's been a few weeks since the actual primary, which was on June 2nd. And one thing that we've seen is Resident Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez Colon is already on the campaign trail with State Senator William Villafañe to push forward. Even though they were on two separate tickets, they've now join forces and, everybody's kumbaya moment.
And I think that that's really important and connected to what will happen legislatively here in Washington, because Jennifer Gonzalez, as opposed to Governor Pierluisi, is a Republican. So what that now opens the door to is for Republicans that have been concerned about addressing this issue based on their kind of preconceived notions that if Puerto Rico were to become a state, it would automatically elect Democrats, to now see that the highest vote getter on the island and the most likely incoming governor for Puerto Rico in November is actually a Republican. I think that that's a perfect segue into our conversation with Professor Charles Venator-Santiago, because we'll be talking to him about the entire legislative history that has brought this issue over the past 125 years to where we are today. Charles Venator-Santiago is a professor of the University of Connecticut with a PhD in political science from UMass Amherst. He's an associate professor with a joint appointment to the Department of Political Science and the Institute for Latino, Caribbean, and Latin American Studies. He's a former president of the Puerto Rican Studies Association. Professor Venator-Santiago teaches courses on public law, American politics, and political theory. His courses focus on U.S. territorial law and politics, citizenship and immigration, and the history of political thought. Professor Venator-Santiago, welcome to the Mano a Mano podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Nice to see you, George.
Likewise. Well, Professor, after meeting you last year at the first public hearing of the Puerto Rico Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, I reached out to connect with you. And then again, earlier this year, I reached out when the news reports came out that you've published, I think, a first-of-a-kind research project, which is a digital database of congressional legislation about the issue of Puerto Rico's political status. Can you tell us a little bit about this Puerto Rico Status Archive project that you've developed, what it is, and what it allows people to do?
Part of what's going on is we're creating a research institute at the University of Connecticut, and we're collecting data and materials that can help in public policy. One of the ideas that we've had is to systematize our knowledge of legislation that's relevant for Puerto Rico in different areas, including the history of citizenship, and we have a similar page for the history of citizenship, the history of status, or the debates over the status about Puerto Rico, and a few other projects. We are eventually going to expand this project to include all the territories. But the idea is that we create an archive that allows us to study the history of the status debates for Puerto Rico in Congress, in Puerto Rico, and in the international realm. And we want to do it by providing primary information, data, documents that are not necessarily readily accessible to the public. So part of the project is to create an archive or repository of primary documents that we want to make public, so that anyone interested in this topic can go to the primary source. The second dimension of this is we're creating something called an interactive dashboard that allows us to put information and give the user the ability to compare and contrast different debates. And again, this is a work in progress. Our goal is to get feedback from people and keep expanding these features. The third dimension is that we're starting to write short reports explaining debates in a systematic way. So when I speak about the status debates, I want to tell you a story that begins in 1898, or at least the current debates. And even though it's taking place today, that it might have a sort of historical dimension to it. So the goal is to create an archive that can give people systematic understanding of the history of the extension of citizenship. Right now, we're primarily documenting federal debates. We have limited the archives to legislation, but we have all the legislative histories that we're hoping to upload. And then we're starting to look into the possibility of uploading Puerto Rican legislation that addresses the question of status. And then eventually all the debates that happen at the United Nations or in international forums.
This is absolutely wonderful. As someone who's dedicated the last almost 20 years of my life to moving forward the conversation on resolving Puerto Rico's political status here in Washington, D.C., and focus specifically on Congress and the executive branch, there is really a lack of understanding by the vast majority of federal elected officials and their staff about how long this history is. A lot of them think that this is something that was just coming up now because Puerto Rico had, a fiscal crisis, or just because Puerto Rico had the hurricanes. And obviously, that is a challenge because there are so many different pieces of this. Their history traces back to many years ago. The policy proposals that are being put forward don't have to reinvent the wheel when a lot of work has already been done to research this, to understand the different legal and constitutional aspects. And yet many in Congress and also in the broader advocacy world are just unaware that all of these materials exist that we can draw on so that we can continue to advance the debate and not get stuck in something that's already been debated multiple times in the past.
So one of the things that, this is really important what you mentioned, one of the things that we did is I sat down year after year with the Congressional Record Index. So the idea is to look at all the legislative debates in Congress from 1898 to the present. And we identified a lot of different legislation that addresses questions of the status. Some are plebiscite legislation, some are referenda, some are status debates, so most are organic acts. But what they all have in common is that they address one dimension of the change of status of Puerto Rico in the broader context.
That's fascinating. And I was reading one of the summary reports that you issued in February. And one of the things that I found absolutely astounding is that your research shows that there's been over 150 pieces of legislation that have been introduced on this issue in the last 125 years. That's a lot.
Well, so one of the things that we did is we went year by year, but then we wanted to understand this debate that took place in 1952. There is a misconception that in 1952, Congress changed Puerto Rico's territorial status to a commonwealth.
Yes.
And that misperception has been promoted by one of the two major political parties in Puerto Rico, the Popular Democratic Party, which argues that the United States invented a compact and an international association agreement to treat Puerto Rico as something other than a territory. Now, it's interesting because all you have to do is read the legislative record, and lawmakers, congressional lawmakers, will tell you and state it that the Puerto Rico's territorial status never changed. This is mostly something for the United Nations, for the rest of the world. It's an arrangement that gives autonomy to a local political party. And it was a local political party, the Autonomous Party, the Popular Democratic Party, that had a relationship with the White House and was looking for some sort of legitimacy. But the legislative record states clearly that Puerto Rico remained an unincorporated territory. So one of the things that we wanted to do is figure out whether there was a change in the debates before or after the enactment of the 1952 Commonwealth legislation. And what we found is that the enactment of that legislation created more anxiety in Congress and more debates around resolving the status of Puerto Rico than we thought. We would have assumed that if Puerto Rico's status had been resolved in 1952, a lot of these debates would have gone away. We would have maybe seen some debates around independence or maybe something around statehood. But what happened is that we almost have twice as many debates after 1952 over the unresolved status of Puerto Rico. The second issue that it's interesting to me is that there's been a sort of paralysis in Congress historically. There are moments in Congress where Congress is interested in addressing the status issue, and this is usually around moments of war or moments of crisis where the United States feels compelled, or Congress feels a little bit compelled to sort of think about Puerto Rico. But those moments pale in comparison to two particular moments. One is the period between 1989 and 1991, where you had a serious effort to solve the question of the status of Puerto Rico, the Bennett-Johnston process. And there was a lot of traction. It's probably the most comprehensive moment. And then we're now at this historical junction that, to my surprise, is getting some traction. It's not a new process. This has been going on for the past, I would say, 20 years, since early 2000. But now there's some traction around this question of the status. And then the other point that I would like to raise is that when we look at the history of status debates for all the 50 states or the debates, there are these moments like what we're facing today where Congress is actually taking seriously the question of status in ways that it hasn't consistently through the past 125 years.
That last point that you bring up, I think, is very important for our audience to understand, because when we look at the other territories that have become states, particularly the last ones, Alaska, Hawaii, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, what we see is that there are a multitude of different legislative projects that are presented at different points, Many of them, don't advance, but there is some debate around them. And then all of a sudden, there's some kind of tipping point that happens. And then the legislation, moves through the process and then gets enacted into law. And all of a sudden, things change. Part of what I'm seeing from my end is the buildup in momentum that is making possible one of those moments of kind of punctuated equilibrium where we just hit that certain threshold where the issue then can move. Obviously, a lot of factors go into when that window of opportunity, opens up, depending on the political parties in power, depending on the broader geopolitical circumstance, like you were mentioning. Obviously, the admission of Hawaii and Alaska in 1959, it had a lot to do with the Cold War and the Soviet Union and the United States really wanting to solidify its position geopolitically and geostrategically. But we're right now also facing a very interesting circumstance where America's global political and military dominance is being questioned, especially in the face of rising Chinese power and influence and the increase in aggressiveness of China and other global competitors like Russia.
So I completely agree, particularly with this notion that there are international pressures that have shaped some of this debate. But there are also some domestic pressures. So, for example, right around the Civil War, there's a perception or a historical idea or narrative that the Civil War was largely caused by the question of slavery, that there is one side, the North, that wants to abolish slavery. And I think that's part of the story. When we looked at the legislative debates, we see a lot of anxiety in the South because Northern Republicans were annexing new states and they were unbalancing the Senate by granting more power to Northern Republican states. So there's this process of colonization. Again, as your audience is probably aware, the United States starts with 13 colonies and 13 states, and it just acquires sufficient territory to build 50 states.
The manifest destiny principle, yeah.
But that manifest destiny was calculated. There are debates on whether we acquire a balance between slave and non-slave states, Republican and Southern Democrat states. But the Republicans sort of took an edge. And there's some really interesting studies about Congress on how the South was more concerned about Republicans gaining more states, especially after the opinion of Dred Scott that declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional and eliminated this pre-accorded political boundary of the North and the South, because that opened the door for Republicans to simply acquire more states and eventually undermine the Democratic power in the South. I think we're experiencing a similar moment right now with the debates between Democrats and the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party. There is a lot of anxiety that Republicans are taking too much power and giving the population the support. And there is some debate around the Democratic Party on whether annexing new states can be beneficial to offset those political debates. If you asked me 2 months ago, well, maybe 6 months ago, I would never have contemplated the idea of statehood for Puerto Rico. I would have said to you, listen, when you look at the history of these debates, there's just no traction to talk about statehood because there's a certain comfort with this sort of in-between territorial status, comfort in Congress, historical. But today, I actually think that there's some debates that are particular to this dynamic, partisan dynamic, that echo in some ways the debates of the mid-19th century, which is around consolidating power in the Senate and consolidating power in the Congress, given the apportionment debates that are taking place in different states. So in that sense, what this story does is it provides some context to help us understand what are not only international pressures, but domestic pressures that could lead to the admission of new states. In this case, potential admission of Puerto Rico. I'm not sure about Washington, D.C., but there is some conversation around granting Washington, D.C. a statehood status.
That's very interesting because I think it also goes to some of the critiques that we've seen by particularly some of the Republican members in the Senate about the possibility of Puerto Rico's statehood. I think it was last year, the year before, Senator Lindsey Graham in a campaign speech indicated that Puerto Rico and DC becomes a state, that's diluting our power, right? I mean, he literally said out loud what probably most think to themselves and find some other excuse, like, Puerto Rico's fiscal situation is an issue. But if we look at all of the territories before they became states, most of them were in economically depressed circumstances. They were economically underperforming because territory status isn't a status that really supports a jurisdiction growing to its full economic potential. And it was only after that a convergence came with the national economic trends. So, those things are brought up as excuses. But I think underlying that is what you're talking about, this consideration of sharing power and whether or not Puerto Rico as a new state would benefit politically more Democrats or Republicans. And, one of the things that we always talk about here in Mano a Mano is that Puerto Ricans are not a foregone conclusion politically, one way or the other. Both Republicans and Democrats have been elected in Puerto Rico, governors of the island, as well as our representatives in the resident commissioner position in the House of Representatives. Just last weekend, we had a primary between the incumbent governor of Puerto Rico, Pedro Pierluisi, Democrat, who served 2 terms in the House as resident commissioner, extremely successful in that role, and our current resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, who's a Republican and is currently serving her 2nd term as resident commissioner, and beat out Pedro Pierluisi, and not by a small margin, by a significant one. So it shows that whatever that kind of general concept that Puerto Rico would automatically tilt one way or another, it may not be the case.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that I was just thinking about the case because in the case of Jennifer Gonzalez, she's also identified as a Trumpist. I mean, not just a Republican. And Trump, during Hurricane Maria, received a sort of bad publicity over some of his sort of reactions to how to respond to the crisis in Puerto Rico. But even in that midst, you have the majority of probably the largest political party in Puerto Rico right now, the statehood party, gravitating in her direction, which to me, again, affirms the idea that Puerto Rico is a very plural place. And I tend to think that Puerto Ricans would identify more as conservative Democrats in the Joe Manchin tradition. But Jennifer Gonzalez is one as a Republican, as a public Republican. And there are Republicans that have stood out in the statehood party in Puerto Rico. So yes, in that sense, I think this is an opportunity to understand some of the synergies between federal politics and domestic politics, which again are linked in some ways to the population migration of Puerto Ricans and their increased participation at a state level, particularly in Florida, and at a national level. I mean, we, after all, have several Puerto Rican representatives who serve not only on the behalf of their states, but also claim to represent Puerto Rico.
Yeah, and I think the point that you bring up right now actually relates directly to another topic that I would like to address with you, which is the topic of U.S. citizenship. Puerto Rico's been under the U.S. flag for 125 years, since 1898. But now for 106 years, people in Puerto Rico have been U.S. citizens under federal law. And part of the result of that is that under territory status, the island does not have representation in Congress. It can't vote for president. And then Congress can discriminate against us under federal laws and programs. But as United States citizens, we can basically get a one-way airplane ticket and move to New York, or in your case, your family's case, Connecticut, right? I have a mother that lives in Oregon, for God's sakes. You know what I'm saying? We're all over the place. And the net impact of that over the course of the last century is that you now have close to 6 million Puerto Ricans living stateside, and the island population has dropped from a peak of 4 million in the year 2000 down to the current census estimates, which I think are around 3.2 million. But all of those Puerto Ricans who move stateside, they're eligible to vote if they're over the age of 18. They're capable of holding their members of Congress accountable and participating in the national political process. So do you think that that has also been a significant factor in increasing the amount of attention that Congress pays to this issue and to the need to address this issue of resolving Puerto Rico's political status.
I'm going to take this opportunity, I'm sorry,
Yep.
To hijack a little
Sure.
bit this conversation a little bit. Because I think this question of citizenship is really interesting and really important in ways that you're highlighting, but in also other ways that I'd like to emphasize. So when the United States acquires Puerto Rico, women acquire the ability to acquire U.S. citizenship through something called coverture from the beginning. They couldn't transmit their citizenship until U.S. citizenship until 1934. But before that, anytime a Puerto Rican woman married a U.S. citizen, she became an automatic citizen as a result of the doctrine of coverture, which basically said marriage is a form of naturalization. And then Congress went through this process of gradually extending different types of citizenship to Puerto Rico. Between 1906 and 1940, Congress enacted probably about 10 or 15 laws, depending on how you count these laws, that gave Puerto Ricans a naturalized citizenship status. That begins with the 1906 Bureau of Immigration Naturalization Act. It culminates with the Jones Act of 1917. And then there are some amendments that end up in 1940. But in 1940, Congress declared that Puerto Rico is going to be a part of the United States for citizenship purposes and extends birthright citizenship. Now, we can quibble what's the constitutional source of birthright citizenship in the Constitution, and I would argue that there's only one. I argue that there's only one, the 14th Amendment, and this is part of a debate that's beyond this conversation. But whether you agree with me or not, the point is that in 1940, Congress established that birth in Puerto Rico was tantamount or the equivalent to birth in the United States for birthright citizenship purposes. That creates a sort of permanent relationship that is different than all the other citizenship relationships prior to 1940. Now, the question is, why is Congress creating a permanent link through citizenship with Puerto Ricans in 1940? And I would argue it's not because of the war. I think it was mostly because of administrative issues. But in doing so, it opens the door for a different kind of conversation around what's the relationship of Puerto Ricans to the United States. Now, as early as 1922, the Supreme Court declared in Balzac versus People of Puerto Rico that the citizenship of Puerto Ricans was the same as that of the United States. What determined the application of the Constitution was the status of the territory, not the status of the citizen. And just to explain a simple argument, states have electoral colleges. Territories don't have electoral colleges. So any U.S. citizen, whether they're born in the mainland or they're born in Puerto Rico, loses the right to participate in presidential elections because Puerto Rico, as a territory, like any other territory, does not have an electoral college. It has very little to do with citizenship. But the point that I think is really important is that right around the 1950s, you see this influx of Puerto Ricans settling in the United States to the point that, as you said, there's more than 6 million Puerto Ricans living in the United States. They're primarily clustered in about 13 states, mostly in the Northeast, although the South is gaining a lot of Puerto Ricans. In fact, Florida has the largest number of Puerto Ricans in the nation, even though Connecticut has the highest percentage of Puerto Ricans. Florida, where they've surpassed 1.2 million inhabitants, and they're becoming increasingly a power force in Florida elections.
Definitely.
And there are a lot of Puerto Ricans in Florida that are identifying not just with the statehood party, but also with the Republican Party, which sort of questions the assumption that all Latinos or Puerto Ricans are going to be monolithic Democrats. But part of what that has done is it's affirmed, how should I say, a connection between Puerto Ricans and the United States that sometimes gets overlooked. And the question of citizenship for me merits a different kind of conversation because it established a permanent link between Puerto Ricans and the United States that can't be changed or erased by changing the status of Puerto Rico. In other words, if Puerto Rico became an independent country, you can't just strip away the citizenship status of Puerto Ricans. So that conversation sort of changes the debate around the status, or at least it should change the debate. The problem is that we're still having sort of these political conversations that are not necessarily in tune with the legal relationship or the legal debates that have shaped the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. And citizenship is a major challenge for any kind of status conversation.
I think what you're highlighting reveals why the citizenship question, the question of United States citizenship for the people of Puerto Rico, really does connect to the heart of this debate of how to resolve Puerto Rico's political status. Prior to the Supreme Court decision they mentioned in 1922 by Balzac, the concept that was applicable in US federal law and in constitutional law was that at the moment in which citizenship was granted to a territory, that was considered incorporation, right? At least that was the way that was interpreted in the case of Hawaii and Alaska, when the courts had to review those jurisdictions and determine what their relationship was to the United States Constitution. Under territorial incorporation, it's assumed that you're a permanent part of the Union, right? And that ultimately you're going to become a state. But what the Balzac decision did, it delinked the citizenship being granted to the people in the territory of Puerto Rico and then all subsequent territories from the full application of the United States Constitution, but then also from the eventuality that it would become a state at some point in the future. So we've had this possibility of Puerto Rican independence continue to be alive, even though, for all practical purposes, right now, if you granted independence to Puerto Rico, you couldn't just strip United States citizenship from everyone that lives on the island without violating the Constitution. You would essentially need to stop U.S. citizenship from being granted to future generations born on the island and essentially wean the island off of United States citizenship to eventually have its own citizenship, become the majority, if that's even feasible, because obviously the people who retain their U.S. citizenship could just move stateside and have their kids there.
Well, no, it's interesting you say that because, well, two things. I want to emphasize this point that you mentioned. What Balzac does is states when Congress wants to explicitly incorporate Puerto Rico, then it can do so through legislation, explicit legislation. Whereas prior to Balzac, the assumption was that Congress could implicitly or explicitly incorporate a territory. Implicitly, by collectively naturalizing the residents of the territory, then it welcomed the territory as an incorporated territory. Balzac put a crack on that and said, no, this has to be done. Congress has to take an affirmative decision. The second point that's really interesting is that it won't be until 1948 that Congress enacts legislation, barring, in some ways, congressional legislation from stripping Puerto Ricans out of their citizenship. So even though in 1940 Congress extends birthright citizenship, those who had acquired citizenship as naturalized citizens were still subject to these denaturalization statutes that applied to all naturalized citizens. But in 1948, Congress passed an obscure legislation that in some ways guaranteed a permanent protection to Puerto Rico persons who acquired citizenship by birth in the United States. That was equal or tantamount to that's afforded to birthright citizens in the United States. Now, that's important because it creates a contradiction in a lot of debates. On the one hand, there is no grant of statehood, but Puerto Ricans selectively, when it's convenient, are treated as members of the United States, like if they were residing in a state. Simultaneously, there is the open door for independence, but at the same time, the United States has affirmed a permanent relationship with the bearers of U.S. citizenship. And those contradictions have made it hard to sort of have a coherent debate around the status question or the status resolution of Puerto Rico. Now, what we're seeing in Johnston debates between 1989 and 1991 was that Congress became aware of that contradiction. And now, with the Puerto Rico Status Act, there is an effort to sort of move beyond that contradiction. I mean, there is an open conversation about these contradictions, but there is an open commitment to thinking beyond that. And that's why I think we're in a historical moment, because even congressional debates are aware of these contradictions and are willing to tackle them or engage them.
Yeah, and going back to the legislative process, I think it's really fascinating that even in this last 20 years, since 2000 to now, a multitude of different legislative proposals have been put forward. Two of them have passed the House, the HR 2499, which is Puerto Rico Democracy Act that passed in 2010, and then the Puerto Rico Status Act that passed in 2022. Both of those bills essentially offered island residents a vote on a choice on the future of Puerto Rico status. In the case of the Puerto Rico Status Act, Congress decides to state that the current territory status, which has always been offered as an option for people in Puerto Rico, because it's kind of an easy thing for the federal government. I don't really have to deal with this, messy issue of what would happen if people chose independence, but then I have an independent sovereign entity where, 100% or 99% of the people there are all United States citizens. Like that's a sticky wicket if I've ever seen one, right? So they've always offered the current territory status as part of an option because that would be comfortable. But, in the Puerto Rico Status Act, they took the step of actually eliminating the current territory status as an option and only offering non-territorial status options, which under the U.S. Constitution are basically two. It's statehood or independence, and independence comes in two flavors, regular independence and a form of independence called free association, which in the bill is described as sovereignty and free association. But ultimately, both of those mean that you're outside of the U.S. Constitution.
Now, and it's interesting that you say that because free association or sovereignty and free association is trying to distinguish itself by arguing that there are going to be these special treaties or relationships that are going to afford Puerto Ricans the ability to retain some links with the United States, as opposed to the idea of independence that presupposes a complete break with the United States. And I'm not sure that would happen.
No, I don't think so either.
And the question is, how do you negotiate those things? The free association option, in some ways, tries to flesh those out through negotiation. Now, what's really interesting here is that in doing so, you're giving Puerto Ricans a choice or you're forcing Puerto Ricans to make a choice between two types of relationships. And, you're taking out, in some ways, 45% of the electorate from that. You're forcing 45% of the electorate to choose to either retain a status quo or an enhanced status quo or gravitate towards the unknown independence option. And that, in some ways, for me, creates sort of a push in some ways towards statehood. Now, the question is, why would Congress concede that historically? And I say this in all honesty. When I look at the history of legislation, the Commonwealth option was the comfortable option.
For the federal government.
Malleable. For Congress, for the federal government,
Yep.
For agencies. It's malleable. When you had to apply international law, you could do so. When you had, or international norms, you can say it's a compact of free association, or it's a Commonwealth. When you had to discriminate negatively, you could do so, or positively, treat Puerto Rico better than a state. So, for example, PROMESA, the Fiscal Oversight Board legislation that is governing Puerto Rico, gives Puerto Rico protections that no state has, bankruptcy protections that are the envy of any state. Particularly,
but it also withdraws the local self-government that Puerto Rico has and essentially overturns the locally approved constitution that we had in 1953. It says, hey, that was really nice that you did that in 1953, but guess what? This federal law supersedes that, and we've got the 7 unelected people that are going to tell your governor and your legislature what they need to do.
Exactly. So you have the discrimination. You put in a fiscal oversight board over an island, not just a city or a town, which under statehood would become unconstitutional, by the way, given the New York Supreme Court precedent. But the idea is that under this Commonwealth status, you have the ability to go in either direction, to discriminate negatively or positive. And now, for the first time, we have legislation that passed under the 117th Congress that is going to get another hearing soon, that in some ways is willing to go one step beyond the Commonwealth option and say, all right, choose statehood or some variants of independence. And that's new. That's a historical moment that Congress has agreed, or I should say Congress has agreed, that a large enough number of congressional leaders and representatives have agreed to. And that's a particular moment in history that's different than prior debates.
And you know what? One of the things looking at the database that you produce that I think is also being seen now is one of the features you've built into the database is the capacity to look at the co-sponsors for legislation, what political parties they're from, where the sponsors of the bills come from in terms of the different states that they're from. And one of the things that I see is that there's been support for addressing this issue, both on the Democrat and the Republican side, for the entire history of this debate. And even right now, when the bill passed, the Puerto Rico Status Act, the House in 2022, it did pass with unanimous support from Democrats and with a statement of administration policy from the Biden administration in support of the legislation, but it also had 16 Republican votes, which is absolutely fascinating given that, just a couple of weeks later, Republicans were going to take over the House and enter the current session of Congress. But now looking at what has happened in this session of Congress, the bills have been reintroduced. The House bill, again, has both Democrats and Republicans supporting it, although obviously more Democrats are supporting it. And a Senate bill has been presented, which is the Heinrich bill. And now that bill has obtained more support than any other bill that has ever been introduced in the Senate. And looking at your database, I think it shows that historically we are kind of at an inflection point of more support for this by members of the Senate than ever before. Republicans are still kind of dragging their feet on getting involved in this issue in the Senate, but I do think that it shows that there's a mounting historical trend that's happening there that can't be overlooked and dismissed as just a fluke.
Yeah, and again, what's interesting about that is that right now there are only two options on the table, whereas before it was easier to jump on board on a plebiscite because you had that third option, that sort of escape valve, if you will, to fall back upon. So that signals to me a different kind of attitude in Congress. Now, granted, are you going to be able to mobilize enough Republicans to vote or to at least support this measure, with the understanding that it is likely that Puerto Rico would become, or at least have two Democratic senators, or at least one Democratic senator? That's a different conversation. But there is a moment here that I think we have to appreciate, where at least the majority of Democrats are on board with supporting statehood for Puerto Rico for the first time in a long time. And it's different now because of not just the co-sponsors, but the language of the bill itself.
Yeah. And I think that the primary victory by Resident Commissioner Gonzalez Colon, and the probability that she may very well be elected as the governor of Puerto Rico in November, at least every indicator would be that she has the best shot at winning that election, could mean that you could have Republican governor running Puerto Rico starting 2025. And that could also kind of shift perspectives for Senate Republicans and other Republican House members. I think it would at least show them that Puerto Rico is a competitive jurisdiction and that it's not a foregone conclusion that Democrats are going to take, every seat in every election on the island.
It's important to also highlight that Puerto Rico's partisan landscape has shifted in the past two elections. Now you have a right-wing sort of religious fundamentalist group that hasn't come out explicitly identifying as Republican, but has a lot of likely Republicans, the Partido Dignidad, or the Party of Dignity. And then you have an alternative fifth party, Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana movement, that has an aggregation of multiple parties. So there are a lot of statehood advocates that are gravitating to that political party. Now, how much power do they have? We'll see what happens after the debates that are taking place in Puerto Rico, particularly in the courts. But the point is that the partisan landscape has pluralized. That's a little bit more complicated because the Commonwealth Party has in some ways imploded after several Supreme Court rulings, after the enactment of Promesa, which stripped the local government of a lot of autonomy, and because of political decisions that the party has made not to engage in a lot of these debates, and actually refusing to sort of engage Congress on plebiscitary debates, which prior advocates of the Commonwealth would have rejected. They would have said, we want to be part of this conversation and steer in our direction, like any politician would do. So you have this sort of crisis of this party, but you also have all the political parties that are emerging that are articulating a different idea or a challenge to the idea that Puerto Rico would become a democratic state. And I guess we need to hear more of that in the mainland, or we need to hear more of that in the public debates. But we'll see what happens in November.
One area that I think would be interesting for our audience to think about is how the experience of Puerto Ricans stateside as United States citizens moving from the island kind of pushed out because of this territorial inequality issues and, all the factors that are kind of driving people to seek equal opportunities and full rights, how their experience has been similar to and different from other Latinos who have come to this country as immigrants, not as citizens. And I think the reason why it'd be interesting to get your perspective on this for our audience is because, nationally, there's been a growing trend of awareness that Latinos are not a political monolith. That they have different views as different subgroups, that Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans and Colombian Americans are very different than Mexican Americans, which in and of themselves are a huge group that are very diverse as well. And Puerto Ricans have been seen traditionally, particularly in the northeast of the United States and the Midwest, as being very liberal, very much aligned with the democratic values. But as you point to, Florida as the highest growth of Puerto Rican population in the last decades, there's a lot of Puerto Rican voters that have ended up identifying and voting for Republicans. So how do you see that intersection between coming to the United States as citizens for Puerto Ricans and the experience that they've had in comparison to other Latino groups who have come to the United States as immigrants without U.S. citizenship?
I obviously I study Puerto Rico, and I find the Puerto Rican case really interesting to tell us, or to help us understand the complexity of the United States. And I think the case of Connecticut and Florida are emblematic of this, or symptomatic of this. So Puerto Rico, Connecticut has the highest proportion of Puerto Ricans in the nation. It's the sixth, in terms of quantity or numbers, it's the state with the sixth largest number. But what we've seen is that Puerto Ricans have been able to incorporate into the political landscape. Connecticut has 17 Latino lawmakers, and 13 of those lawmakers are Puerto Rican. That's
Wow.
the highest number of any legislative body that's Puerto Rican. In the same vein, we have a Secretary of Justice that's from Connecticut, Puerto Rico, and we have a Supreme Court Justice. And that one's a real paradigm. That's a real interesting thing. And again, I am a fan of Sonia Sotomayor, with all my criticisms to her, the Supreme Court, but I think she's really smart and she contributes a lot of things. And I just think a lot of great things about her. But she doesn't bring any votes. I mean, relatively speaking, if President Obama wanted to appeal to a constituency, he, based on votes, he would have appointed a Mexican Supreme Court justice. Again, this is not a criticism of Sonia Sotomayor. I think it speaks volumes of what President Obama saw in her ability to contribute to the court. And I want to emphasize that. So in some ways, Puerto Ricans have integrated into government structures throughout the United States in really important ways that sort of are competitive, given the small number of Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans account for less than 3% of the Latino population in the mainland United States. But they've been able to sort of interspace political powerful spaces in influential ways. At the same time, if you look at the case of Connecticut, Puerto Ricans in Connecticut has the highest levels of poverty in the United States. Puerto Ricans in Connecticut are routinely confused with Mexicans. I mean, we have plenty of news examples of where you have these that are residents of Connecticut who see somebody speaking Spanish, and they immediately assume that they have to be Mexican and they have to be crossing the border illegally. And that's just a stereotype that just pervades throughout. And we see it in Connecticut today, a blue state, a progressive state. In the case of Florida, one of the interesting things is that after Hurricane Maria, then Governor Rick Scott took a very supportive position for Puerto Ricans migrating to Florida, either temporarily or in some cases permanently. So for a lot of Puerto Ricans, Governor Rick Scott became a sort of hero, somebody who
Definitely
stood up for them. And it's important to contrast that, because Connecticut has a lot of them. Well, there are no Republican Puerto Rican legislators. By the way, most identify with a sort of pro-statehood position. They have a sort of liberal politics for some things, and they're very conservative for others. But they also see statehood in a different light. Statehood is a civil rights issue that brings a sense of equal justice to U.S. citizens who live in Puerto Rico. But we're starting to see from polls and other research that Puerto Ricans in Florida value the idea of Republicans as being able to contribute. I mean, Governor DeSantis at one point supported legislation that provided for the incorporation of Puerto Rico. He's since sort of backed away from that. But you had even sort of these sort of right-wing conservative Republicans aligning themselves in some ways with the idea that Puerto Rico could be a part of the United States in more significant ways. Whether it's
you have some of them that, outright support statehood. I mean, that's been a significant base of the co-sponsors that we've been able to obtain for some of the past bills on this come from Republicans in Florida.
And I think a lot of that has to do with Puerto Ricans settling in at least 13 states and exercising local pressure and participation,
and the right to vote,
primarily, and the right to vote. But they're sort of entering elected office at various levels throughout states. I have been arguing for several years that we will see a discussion of statehood from the bottom up. That is, when Puerto Ricans in different states exercise some sort of pressure internally within the states, that's what's going to propel, in my opinion, one of the major supports for statehood. And we're seeing some of that right now. I mean, I spend a lot of time with lawmakers here in Connecticut, and the majority see statehood as a sort of vehicle for social justice, and they're advocating for that. They're Democrats. They identify as progressive. Sometimes I think they're more conservative than anything, but they're pushing for a resolution to the status. At this point, the Puerto Ricans are primarily clustered in 13 states. So I'm not sure how much power Puerto Ricans will have through the states, but I think we're seeing a different kind of pressure that we haven't seen before. And this is part of the sort of complex moment that we're living in. We have the sort of Democratic versus Republican internal debate between Trump and apportionment, and Democrats feeling that that they have more voters, but they're not getting as many seats in Congress. And then you have local elected officials that are starting to have a conversation about statehood as an alternative for Puerto Rico.
With the local officials and the federal officials, they're also seeing the debates come up around the unequal treatment of Puerto Ricans in all these other areas like Medicare and Medicaid, nutritional assistance, and disaster aid, and all of these different areas where they're having to address these issues over and over and over again. And frankly, there's no systematic way of addressing all of these issues without a change in the territory status. So that's where kind of the linkage from the social justice perspective of how do we address these different issues connects with the status debate.
Well, no, but this is really important what you're saying, because after Hurricane Maria, we were contracted, I guess, or hired to do some studies for the state of Massachusetts, and particularly city of Holyoke. And then I was working with the Governor's Commission here in Connecticut. And one of the first questions that we received from both Massachusetts and Connecticut governments was, we don't understand what entitlements apply and what are portable, what move back and forth. We don't understand how SSI applies in Puerto Rico or not, what benefits are transferable, particularly when we're looking at Section 8 vouchers or other types of social services, Medicaid and later Medicare. So in that sense, part of what's happening is that after Puerto Ricans start relocating to the United States with Maria, is that local governments are starting to question, and they're starting to look for some sort of guidance, because they're receiving a lot of Puerto Ricans migration. And then the other issue is, as citizens, a lot of Puerto Ricans are moving constantly. So they may arrive in New Jersey, but they'll end up in New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and then elsewhere.
And nowadays, often in Texas and California and other places, it's
in Florida. Yeah. And they're exercising political power because they're growing in those places. So in that sense, I think citizenship has opened the door, not just for participation, but also for mobility. And then not just for electoral participation, but also for mobility in elected office and in positions of relative power, I should say, at a local level.
I really appreciate that perspective. Moving the conversation in another direction has to do with the role that students and academics can play in actually contributing to the movement and the political pressure and providing information that helps to advance the debate on these issues. Because obviously part of what has limited the debate from being able to advance legislative in Congress in the past has been having to re-educate members of Congress and people in federal elected office, each time. So part of it is people like you coming and bringing accessible and available information that can provide this historic context. But we also see, one of the things that I'm seeing is that there's also another shift in that there's an actual citizens movement that is involved right now in the advocacy effort for addressing the political status, which just wasn't present before. In the Puerto Rico Statehood Council, we've got supporters literally in all the 50 states. We've got on our email list close to 60,000 people, and they open our messages, they read our content, they engage with us. They're sending, letters and emails to their members of Congress. And then we've also had the development of this extended congressional delegation, which is part of the shadow delegation to Congress that Puerto Rico sent. And it's fascinating because when you see some of the people there, they're everyday citizens coming from states from Rhode Island, Florida, Connecticut, Maryland, Virginia, Ohio, Georgia. But that is also, I think, a shift. It's not just the politicians in Puerto Rico that are advancing this issue, or the political parties on the island, or even politicians stateside, but there's also this mix of academics coming and chiming in and providing information and context, and then average everyday citizens engaging and doing kind of that citizen advocacy. How do you see those other factors kind of playing into this?
I don't want to sound like an elitist ivory tower snob because I'm not. But I think the academic debates have been dominated by legal scholars who have made important arguments and important contributions. And I can name you, 25 legal scholars right now, starting with some well-known Puerto Rican legal scholars who have shaped debates in important ways. Unfortunately, and I spend a lot of time with academics, there has been a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of protagonism, a lot of sort of reductionist narratives, arguments to describe the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, which in my opinion is a very complicated relationship full of contradictions. Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory that can be subject to discrimination in any direction, but it also receives billions of dollars in subsidies, billions of dollars in support. What colony gets $700 million from FEMA to do public works? What colony gets $30 to $40 billion a year in subsidies to address kinds of issues? I mean,
and what colony does any country have on Earth where they have, $70 billion worth of interstate commerce happening every year? I mean, that's the other side of the equation. Puerto Rico is not an insignificant jurisdiction economically for the United States, because in those $70 billion that come back and forth from the island to the States, there's tons of jobs and companies and, other business ties that are benefited greatly from the island, and likewise on the island from being able to sell goods and products stateside. So it is very different than with other places.
And I think a lot of academics don't understand or don't want to accept those debates. There's a tendency among Puerto Rican academics in particular to have reductionist debates around victimhood and oppression and colonialism that obscure the contradictions. And I think what we need to do is explore those contradictions and address them head on. And then let's see how you can mobilize voters in whatever direction. However, I think academics have the power to amplify the debates. They have the power to communicate with elected officials, with the average voter, with citizens, in ways that other individuals don't, or other elected officials don't. They have the power of education. You can come to my classroom and I can give you a whole semester's worth of lectures that can explain all these contradictions and challenge students to go out in the streets and go out into the world and think about how they live with these contradictions and what they're going to do. So in that sense, I think academics can play a key role, but we need to have more critical understanding of the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. And that's sort of what we're trying to do with this page. We're saying, here's some information, rethink this relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, and here's the evidence to sort of rethink this relationship, and look at the contradictions and see how you grapple with the contradictions. My concern is that there's a tendency among academics and some activists to reduce debates to very simplistic tropes, and that doesn't help us understand the contradictions and how to move beyond those or resolve those contradictions. And I think at the end of the day, we have to deal with the question of status. I mean, I'm in the middle of this debate on whether the insular cases should be abolished or not, and I agree the insular cases enable the discrimination of Puerto Rico, but eliminating the insular cases doesn't change the territorial status of Puerto Rico, and it doesn't guarantee parity. Territories in the 19th century were subject to all kinds of discrimination, less than unincorporated territories. And there was no administrative apparatus before the during the 19th century, which complicates the conversation. Right now, federal agencies have direct control or access to every aspect of Puerto Rican life. There were no federal agencies that had that power during the 19th century. So the jurisprudence, territorial jurisprudence that was applicable in the 19th century would kick in, and all of a sudden you'd have a really tyrannical government exercising power. So part of what I think we need to understand is the historical complexity of U.S. territorial law before and after the enactment of the insular cases, and put it in context. And then also recognize that until we make a decision on the status of Puerto Rico, we're not going to solve any of these contradictions. And that's, of course, acknowledging that whatever status is chosen or the voters choose is going to also create other problems and challenges.
Of course,
which we'll have to deal with after.
But it will at least help both the United States and Puerto Rico get onto whatever the new part of their historic relationship is going to be. Because I think that if anything became absolutely clear in the 2015, 2016 period where we had the enactment of Promesa, is that the fiscal and economic reality of Puerto Rico under territory status will never reach its full potential. Under territory status, Puerto Rico is basically permanently going to underperform economically, and that's going to have an impact both fiscally and economically, but also demographically, which is something that doesn't necessarily help the island, because as more people leave, you lose your labor force, you lose your tax base, you lose your consumers. And how does the United States benefit from having a jurisdiction that is getting weaker and weaker under the territory status? But in order to kind of wrap things up, I'd love to give you an opportunity to tell our audience a little bit more about how they can find out information about your project, access that, and anything, kind of closing thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience.
So let me emphasize 4 points as an academic. And the first is there are 3 research centers that focus on Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico and the United States. The Puerto Rico Research Hub in Florida, run under the University of Central Florida, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies in Hunter College CUNY, and the Puerto Rican Studies Initiative at UConn. We just met last week, and there's a conversation around, and there are no Puerto Rican Studies Institutes in Puerto Rico. We just met to talk about creating a consortium where we're going to bring all the Puerto Rican Studies research, data, public policy into one umbrella. But the idea is that we're going to have centralized sources of information that are reliable, that are based on empirical data, that bring together other organizations. And that will give us an opportunity to have sort of legitimate, information that is empirically based, that's based on evidence from official sources. I am running the Puerto Rican Studies Initiative as an effort to bring all academic resources to the table to systematically provide information on a range of issues: status debates, oral histories, citizenship, and so on and so forth. So people can go to the Puerto Rican Studies Initiative webpage at the University of Connecticut. The goal is to provide resources. We're funded by the Connecticut State General Assembly. So this is a public taxpayer effort to provide clear and honest information. And then the third thing that I want to emphasize is that we need people to call us and says, you made a mistake here, or we want more information about this. I really believe that if we have good information, reliable information, everybody benefits.
Definitely.
Regardless of our partisan alignments or whether we believe it or agree with each other, our goal is to provide the best possible information that can help people make decisions and better understand challenges. And the fourth point that that I want to add is that we need also ideas from people that tell us, listen, you should incorporate this project. So give me feedback about what's right or wrong, but also tell me you should incorporate this debate. So based on our previous personal conversation between you and me, George, we already began the process to start collecting all the legislation in the Puerto Rican General Assembly, or the equivalent of the Puerto Rican Congress, on status legislation.
That's fantastic.
We're in the middle. We're in the middle of a debate right now because in 2020, the Puerto Rican General Assembly passed legislation that essentially calls for the application of statehood to Puerto Rico. And then there's this also effort to sort of translate current federal legislation and create a plebiscite in Puerto Rico. So you have two potentially competing sources of law. But for me, that's great because it gives you the fuller picture of the debates. And I think if you have a more informed debate, you can make more informed choices. So we want to hear from you. But again, visit us at UConn. You can just type Puerto Rican Studies Initiative at UConn and you'll get a range. And then we're hyperlinking everything. So based on what kind of information, you can always get it through those sources. And then, of course, I just hired 2 social influencers, social media influencers. So feel free to join our social media because we're releasing information every week. So we try to release 1 or 2 reports a week in case you're interested in particular types of information, not just about status debate, but about citizenship, around policy, around social issues that are important for Puerto Ricans in Connecticut and elsewhere.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing to help bring this valuable information out to the public, both stateside and in Puerto Rico. I think it's an incredibly important contribution to this ongoing debate about the resolution of Puerto Rico's political status and also contextualizing it in all of these historical, geopolitical, and other dimensions. And I just want to express my gratitude and appreciation for you being on the podcast. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, Professor Venator-Santiago.